church towers were among the first to host public clocks, but these were far from mobile. They relied on heavy weights and gravity. So unless you were dragging around a bell tower, you really had no idea what time it was. That's fine, but what if you were a sailor or a military officer trying to coordinate your troops? In the early days, that would carry a big, heavy clock around with them. Or they even might have had a sundial watch. Yeah, I saw it myself. But that's not exactly what I would call convenient or reliable. In 1510, Peter Heinlein built a very heavy, round Nuremberg egg, so they called it. It was the first to be able to provide a transportable solution to telling time. Although it quickly became renowned for being imprecise, even Shakespeare mentioned it in Love's Labour Lost. What I love, I sue, I seek a wife, a woman that is like a German clock, still a-repairing, ever out of frame, and never going right, being a watch, but being watched, that it may still go right. A flurry of innovations happened in the 17th century, and by the 1680s, pocket watches became reliable, within, well, like 30 minutes per day or so. And watches with a minute hand even became commonplace. Like, what a concept. For about 50 years, from 1675 to 1725, British watches were regarded as the best in the world. They were so good that counterfeiting became a widespread problem. Yeah, Dutch makers might try to write the name of a British watchmaker on the front of their own watches and try to sell it for more in Amsterdam. During this time, France felt that they were really falling behind. It wouldn't be until 1770, a full 50 years later, that Jean-Antoine Lépine introduced a radically new movement layout, so they call it, known as the Lépine calibre. His design changes not only allowed for a much thinner case, but also simplified production. The trend then was for thinner and thinner watches that allowed to slip delicately into a man's pocket. This is a letter from the newly elected President George Washington to Governor Morris in Paris, and it shows that these watches were really the hot item. Dear Sir, I had a pleasure to receive your letter of the 12th by the last mail. I am much obliged by your offer of executing commissions for me in Europe, and shall take the liberty of charging you with only one. I wish to have a gold watch procured for my own use, not a small trifling nor finically ornamented one, but a watch well executed in point of workmanship, and about the size and kind of that which was procured by Mr. Jefferson for Mr. Madison, which was large and flat. I imagine Mr. Jefferson can give you the best advice on the subject, as I am told this species of watches which I have described can be found cheaper and better fabricated in Paris than at London. Around the same time, the Swiss watches were becoming more and more accurate and far less expensive. So inexpensive that the British and French watchmakers wrote them off, didn't even consider them to be competitive. So how were they making the same high-tech watches? High up in the mountains of Switzerland, in the isolated town of Chaux-de-Fonds, long winters with little sun for farming created a unique opportunity. Poor families needed work during the cold season, so watchmakers in Geneva began outsourcing labor to the rural mountain areas, knowing that they could pay them less than those in the Geneva Guild, for example, who were well trained and therefore well paid. Instead of asking them to make an entire watch, which would be much too complicated, they would train one family to make one part in their home, and then another family to make some other widget at home. And so by the turn of the 19th century, the town of Chaux-de-Fonds was entirely taken over by watchmaking. This is a description by Karl Marx from his famous Das Kapital. He paints a picture of a massive factory spread out over the entire town. Formerly the individual work of an artificer, the watch has been transformed into the social product of an immense number of detail laborers, such as mainspring makers, dial makers, spiral spring makers, jeweled hole makers, ruby lever makers, hand makers, case makers, screw makers, gilders, and on and on. The list actually takes up a third of an entire page, so I won't list them all here. But then he goes on to say, and last of all, the repasseur, who fits together the whole watch and hands it over in a going state. Here he is referring to the établisseur, or the person who has contracted this work among all of the hundreds of laborers scattered across the town. He also notes that it is much more profitable because the établisseur does not have the overhead costs of, like a physical workshop, and he doesn't have to pay for the tools that they use. And plus, there's more competition for these specialized jobs because, they get to work from home. Sounds familiar, right? Like, who doesn't want that? But a fire in Chaux-de-Fonds in 1794 devastated the informal wooden construction of this small mountain village, and instead they rebuilt the entire city with watchmaking in mind. Buildings were spaced apart, like the streets were really wide, in order to maximize for natural light in their working home offices, which were at the very top of each of the buildings. Each house had a space for a vegetable garden out front, and a short wall separating the gardens to encourage interaction among their neighbors. Chaux-de-Fonds became essentially a giant horizontal factory because the 19th century saw an explosion in demand for Swiss watches because, they were so much less expensive. And to be fair, in the beginning, not all of them were very good, but the Swiss learned fast and they began to improve. A lot of their improved performance and accuracy can be attributed to organized watch competitions that were put in place to see how accurate they were. Instead of following the marketing of all of these companies, in 1790 there was an official body established to evaluate the different performance of these different watches. And over time the trials became more and more rigorous and more standardized. They became a way of encouraging competition and excellence. They were intense, multi-week tests of a watch's accuracy, and the judges would put it on their wrist to be able to test it as if it were really moving, not just sitting flat. The best performers received certificates and were publicly ranked. And so, over time, these competitions really mattered. A certificate from the observatory could boost a maker's reputation and sales. It really wasn't just marketing. The competitions encouraged innovation and standardized excellence. Unlike the romanticism surrounding Paris or London workshops, the entire Swiss watchmaking community worked together toward higher quality work. You could call it a competitive collective, each maker trying to outdo one another, but all benefiting from sharing their expertise. This system formed a culture, one where precision wasn't an exception, but was expected. During this time, Chaux-de-Fonds saw a series of waves of immigration, creating the ideal labor pool for the rapid expansion of this industry. One scholar writes that a unique combination of factors led to production almost exclusively in this French-speaking region of Switzerland. The abundance of available labor that I just mentioned, that has something to do with it, but also an increasing of what he calls subdivision of tasks, made it possible for workers to acquire skills rapidly. While the familial character of this cottage work meant that women and children were doing work that that in Britain and France was reserved for highly trained journeymen. The very size of the pool, moreover, made it possible to spot and promote a substantial number of especially gifted workers to those tasks: layout, finishing, springing, adjusting, that required special knowledge and higher skills. And so the result was an industry that had it both ways: an abundance of skilled labor at low cost, and a cadre of indigenous and highly qualified artisans who were not only capable of the best work, but were technically creative. So there you go. There is something difficult to define here, but it has to do with culture. And as I pointed out, watchmaking was really confined to French-speaking circles, and exclusively in the Jura region, which is kind of like northwestern Alps. Whatever was happening, it was working, because by 1835, a Mr. John Boring writes that in France, just over the border, not 10 watches were made in the course of the year. That sounds like a bit of an overstatement, but it is true that in 1814, watchmakers in England had petitioned Parliament for relief as they watched their colleagues in London taking Swiss watches, packaging them into British cases to cut down on costs and, sell them for less. But the British didn't seem worried. They were sure that they made a better watch. Here, Edward J. Dent writes, "The Swiss watch is remarkable for its elegance and flatness, the English for its superior make, correct performance for a length of time without cleaning, and durability for many years hence. There is little doubt that the English will continue to maintain their superiority in manufacturing watches having compensation for temperature, as well as in the manufacture of chronometers. Such a watch cannot be supplied by the foreign manufacturer under any circumstances, nor, if he were to make the experiment, could he, the quality of workmanship and weight of the case being taken into consideration, compete with us." Sorry for the terrible British accent. Estimates for watch production show that by 1862, the Swiss production had skyrocketed to 2.5 million watches per year, where Britain was previously producing around 150,000 per year at their peak. Unfortunately, the Swiss position as the industry leader wouldn't last for very long, because a new type of watch production began, and this time with machine-made parts. Would the Swiss make the same mistakes as their predecessors and underestimate this new competition? Stay tuned. I hope that you're enjoying this story. I loved putting this video together. I did so much research on the industry and on this town of the Chaux-de-Fonds, in addition to going there and meeting some of the people and getting to see the museum, Internationale Horlogerie. I had so much fun doing it, and I hope that you're enjoying it. And if you want to see some behind the scenes of upcoming videos, I have about 6 other videos in the works at the moment. And so many more coming this summer. If you want to see some of those behind the scenes of upcoming videos, I'm going to be posting those on my Patreon page. I'm also thinking about doing some wine tasting and kind of giving some notes of the wines that I've found on my journeys. If that's interesting to you, I'm going to post that there as well. In any case, enjoy the rest of the story, and I'll see you soon. American watchmakers, meanwhile, saw the quantity of counterfeit and uneven production coming from even well-known British watchmakers at this time. And they thought, well, we can do better. Aram Dennison and Edward Howard began to build the machines necessary to make all of the individual components of the watch with machines, and standardizing parts in the process. The name of their company changed many times, but eventually became the Wolfgang Watch Company. Production was slow at first. They took 3 years to turn out their first watch, but then 1,000 in the second year. which is about the same as an average shop in London would be making at the time. Watchmaking, it does seem to be difficult, and these early prototype machines needed a lot of calibration to be able to make parts at 1/5000th of an inch. And it was longer and more difficult than they had originally anticipated, with dust being a real challenge. But then came their big break. The Civil War provided lots of extra funding and demand for a huge production of watches. By 1848, they had produced only 14,000 watches, and 15 years later, in 1864, that number was 118,000. The Ellery watch for soldiers was their bestseller. Others watched the success of these machine-made watches and began making their own machines. By 1876, the year of the Philadelphia Exposition, it was millions of watches that they were turning out every year. And a group of Swiss delegates toured the American watch exhibits and were stunned. They saw something they'd never imagined: precision and beauty at a scale that was beyond their comprehension. The Waltham system could produce thousands of watches with consistent quality and at half the price. For the Swiss, it was a real moment of reckoning, because that same year, in 1876, Swiss exports had already reduced to 1/5 of what they had in 1872. And at the same time, another quiet transformation was taking place. Jewish families from the Alsace region of France began settling in Chaux-de-Fonds in the early 19th century. Initially, they worked as traders, dealing in watch parts and finished products. But by mid-century, many had moved into manufacturing themselves, becoming the établisseurs and managing their own production line. But when the American challenge came, they responded quickly. Unlike their Swiss and French peers, who sometimes viewed watchmaking as an art and something to be preserved, many Jewish entrepreneurs saw this as an opportunity, and they quickly adopted machines and changed their entire workflows. They were able and willing then to scale and to meet the rising demand. By the early 1900s, 8 of the 17 largest watchmaking companies in Chaux-de-Fonds were Jewish-owned. Names like Didesheim Brothers and Eugene Bloom of Abel were at the forefront. Their companies not only survived, they thrived. Dr. Stephanie Meyer argues that it is thanks to the adaptability of these Jewish makers who quickly adopted machine-made parts that the entire Swiss industry was able to overcome these competitive challenges and still remain relevant to this day. Although production and jobs were lost during this period, Swiss watches continue to be known as one of craftsmanship and extremely high-quality production. And Chaux-de-Fonds continues to be at the center of that, a place where watchmakers flock due to well-established schools that pass on the savoir-faire, this knowledge of watchmaking. And it's due to this system that's built on collaboration and competition, but also continuous improvement. And there continues to be a culture in Chaux-de-Fonds that's welcoming to all. There are schools that teach Esperanto so that all might be accepted and able to communicate easily with everyone in the world. It is a place that has been captivated by a passion for time. Do you share the passion? If so, let me know in the comments what your favorite watch is and why. And check out my Patreon page for behind the scenes of my upcoming videos. And until then, I will see you next time on French in Spirit. Have a good one.